Welcome to It's About Time. This is where we challenge outdated higher ed models and push for bold student-first reforms. Today we're joined by Stig Leschly, President and founder of the Post-Secondary Commission. This is a groundbreaking accreditor focused on enabling colleges that create measurable economic opportunity for their students. Our conversation will focus on the movement to make higher education more accessible, affordable, and directly connected to career success. Let's jump right in. What personal experience led you to challenge higher education's focus on process and instead advocate for economic returns as a key measure of success?
Well, thanks for the question. The first association I have is to the many years I spent with my colleagues in the K-12 world, where as educators of K-12 students, we sent them off into college and were told over and over by them how important it is for them via college to access economic opportunity, safety, mobility. So I've always begun there. I will always end there. It's for me about the importance of a young person arriving after their education, K-12 and in higher ed. And true also for mid-career professionals returning to the higher ed system to arrive at a place where they can access a good wage, benefits, and the personal freedom that comes with it. So that's the beginning and the end of it. I think that's a thing on which higher education has to help deliver in our society. And so that outcome is one that means a lot to me. It resonates with me as an educator. The other half of the question, which is about really about my sort of skepticism of means regulation, essentially, that goes back for me to my experiences many times in my career as a manager, as an entrepreneur, as a leader of an organization where the right and best and really only one viable posture that can be given to a team is to be asked to deliver the right outcome and then be given some freedom to specialize and innovate and to experiment.
Great. But how do you measure these credential outcomes in terms of wages and increases? And why is this economic mobility a better metric than what we're used to in terms of traditional academic quality measures?
Yeah, sure. The first thing I'll say before I defend careful, fair, precise, intellectually honest measurements of economic results is to say that they're not the only outcomes that matter. Not at all. Let's just pause there for a second. So if you were to just ask students and their families what they care about in college, they will say, almost without exception, that a primary or the primary thing they need from institutions of higher ed is economic freedom, safety, and mobility. They will then go on to list a very long set of genuinely and equally valid needs that they have for higher ed, and they'll express preferences in an enormous variety of institutional designs. So that's the first thing to remember. We're here to serve the students. They want all kinds of colleges in a wide variety, but there's a baseline, nearly unanimous request that their economic future is safeguarded and promoted. So that's the setup. And by the way, I'll add that that's the only outcome. The economic outcome is the only one around which there's bipartisan support. So as a practical matter, it's also the only thing that we could probably get agreement on that we ought to measure. But it's not to the exclusion of other outcomes. That's the first thing. And then there's the next question, which is how on earth would we measure this result in a way that doesn't do more harm than good? That is, I just want to establish as an opening that that's a practical question, it's a tactical question, it's a data question. But for me, at least, it's not a question in principle or policy. It's the right problem to solve. It's the problem that has to be solved. Sadly, we're very far away from solving it, but that's where the work begins.
It's fascinating, and it reminds me of the value-added movement in the K-12 space and the devil in the details there. How do we avoid that measurement kind of quandary and throw out the baby with the bathwater as we get down to these details on metrics?
Well, this is, I could talk for 100 hours on this, and every single one of your listeners would turn this podcast off. So I'll reserve just a few minutes on it because this is where the work lies. And so I'll just mention a few themes. The first thing is we're interested in, here comes, the causal effect or the impact on an actual student when he or she enrolls of the choice to enroll. And we're interested in what happens essentially to their measurable earnings over a baseline specific to them. So in the jargon of what we do, that's called a wage gain, or it's called a value-added earnings result. But in common parlance, what we're actually trying to figure out is if Johnny or Susie hadn't enrolled in your institution, how much would they have earned? And as a result, specifically of enrolling in an institution, that wage trajectory go up or down. So to me, that's an eminently intuitive idea. It's very defensible. In practice, it's very hard to measure because what you get into is real social science. You have to be able to predict what sometimes are called the counterfactual earnings or the control group earnings of actual entering students. It's very tricky to do because, as you know, and this is, I won't go on at length here, but you have to get into very, very large, detailed data sets, usually kept by state governments around the wages in a state and how individual humans of various characteristics by their demographics and their high school experience do in that state to be able to figure out, back to Johnny and Susie, how Johnny and Susie would have done if they hadn't enrolled in your institution. But if you can get that control group done well, the next task then is to just mechanically observe their actual wages. That's also maddeningly hard to do. It's very hard to look up, even for good college presidents like you, what your actual students earn. It's hidden away. So there are very, very deep implementation problems here to get at that wage gain. But if you can get at it, then it's a beautiful construct because notice you're measuring and holding an institution accountable for all the students they take in. We're looking at entrance now. So you can internalize to an institution the economic result of both students who finish and who don't finish. And there's a huge discrepancy in both cases. But you're after this, what I would call a fair and an accurate measurement of the wage gain. You can also look at that wage gain over a period of time to see if it sums to something greater than what the student was charged. So that's what we're after. In a phrase, I would say it's called, we're looking at cumulative wage gains to entrance in colleges, how they sum over time, how they compare to costs. And I also recognize that to do that well, we need an extraordinary level of data access. We have it in some states. Texas, in particular, has very advanced data systems. I'll just go to the other side, because I bet this is your next question. Lots of people set out to agree with this idea. It's repeated often on the left and the right. You can read about it right now in federal regulations called Gainful Employment or in the College Cost Reduction Act. There actually this concept of a wage gain compared to a cost is there, but it's measured very naively. It's really just estimated, and I appreciate the effort. But the data is so scarce in many cases. You get into this sort of opposite and equal challenge, which is if you can't measure it well, I'm not in favor at the institutional level of accountability. So you'll relate to this. It was like, I'm not in favor of anyone from the outside walking up to you and doing a bad job of measuring what you do for your students and holding you accountable for a bad measurement. That's doubly bad. That's bad data married to aggressive accountability. That's a toxic mix. So we have to measure very, very fairly, very accurately. We have to do it in an intellectually honest way. And if we get that far, then I think as an accreditor, we'll start to ask really fair questions in the institution, if needed, and social governments, but not until we get the measurement right.
Do you see the work of the Post-Secondary Commission as an additional accreditation or a replacement accreditation for traditional accreditations?
It can be both. We're seeking from the U.S. Department of Ed a status. It's technically called a recognition by the U.S. Department of Ed as an accreditor that has what's called Title IV gatekeeping authority. So we can become the primary, the institutional accreditor and the source of an institution's access to Title IV for any institution if they want. We think that's vital because it's in that posture that accreditors matter the most. Almost all institutions in American society have to access Title IV accreditation. And so we think the best, the hardest, and most important work is to solve this measurement and accountability problem in that posture.
So to do that, what are some of the challenges that you're running into in terms of traditional accreditation measures and how you move the thought pattern towards something that's less traditional?
Right. Sure. There are many. One I just alluded to, which is we prefer to do this work in states like currently Texas, where we have access to all of this data. As a result, can hire mathematicians and economists to really measure well. In states where we don't have access to this very proprietary data, we can still walk up to some institutions and conclude with confidence that they've created economic mobility, but we have to rely there on general descriptive statistics of that institution. So our ability to form a confident conclusion is just much more limited because of the data. We will always hold the bar high. But so there's a first challenge is we're data hungry. We want access to these data systems to do the work well. The second thing, actually, I don't think we'll have a lot of resistance to, which is this general move, which is if we can measure the output well, then we'll want to hand back to the institutional leaders the freedom to do their day job. And so our kind of North Star is to be fair and tight on the right outcome, and then to hand back to institutional leaders discretion to specialize and innovate. And that gets into, and as an accreditor, we have a meaningful ability to do that because accreditors often electively control the means choices of institutions. There's, of course, a lot of regulatory machinery that we can't release institutions from. Chief among them is federal student aid and all the regulations associated with it, including the credit hour. It's beyond the province of any accreditor, that would include us, to modify that in any way. But I often hear from college presidents that the most detailed means regulations, they don't arise from accreditors. They arise from state governments, and in particular federal student aid regulations, and that's a mix of the good and the bad. So we can't reach that. But as an accreditor, if we can measure well, then we can be partners to high-performing institutions in trying to give them more freedom to modify their faculty, to build new programs, to assemble their buildings and their resources in new and in different ways within the discretion that an accreditor has on those issues.
So let's talk about the credit hour and the Carnegie Unit. I mean, it really is the anchor around our you could say our feet or our neck, however we want to present it. How do we attack that issue? Because if we move to outcome measures and don't have more flexibility on the delivery model, the finances don't work for most institutions. So how do we think about that?
Yeah. Well, also, let me self-identify as a spectator in that fight, again, because that constraint originates in a world adjacent to us. It arises out of federal student aid regulations. So in exchange for accepting a loan or a grant from a student, which is federally underwritten, you, the institution, must comply with these regulations, including chief among them, the credit hour, and all of the machinery built around it. I'll first just share one anecdote to agree with and repeat your question and your concern, which is that in decades now of working with college students, their number one need, profound need, is to study and to go to class when they need to go to class and when they need to study. Why? Because they live complex lives, they have families, and they have jobs. They need to not show up in most cases, I would argue, on 10:30 on a Tuesday morning when the professor feels like lecturing. And when institutions do that, they are being aggressively indifferent to the legitimate needs of students who have to live their lives, make a living, and raise a family while they get educated. And you understand that. It's a lot, I think, of what online, solid, well-intentioned, hardworking online degree programs have done. They've just allowed a modicum of self-organization and self-pacing and giving it back to students, and as they are sort of morally and practically entitled to have it. And this is where the credit hour comes in. It's just brutal because, and really the adequate progress measures and the time-based sequence of this, because it just so profoundly limits the ability of college designs to let students start and stop and to study when they need to study. I don't have a good answer for it. I think, of course, what's happening is that, and this is to be fair to the people who are for these like very tight means regulations, is that they don't yet have the thing that we are so focused on delivering, which is the beneficial alternative, which is let's let these institutions modify, operate, specialize, meet the needs of students, and leave them free to do that we need, as if we're going to do that, to have a really sensible, fair, and accurate definition and measurement of the economic result. So I'm pretty sure every single thing I've said is obvious here. I don't know how or when the credit hour and the machinery around it starts to get loosened up federally. And if I have a prayer about it, it's when we get better at measuring the economic result, because then I think reasonable people across the political spectrum will get back to, all right, let's trade back freedom to the educators to design with more flexibility.
I agree wholeheartedly. If what gets measured gets done, what gets done is what's easy to measure, and time is one of the easiest things that we have to measure. And you're tackling something on the other end of that spectrum.
Yeah, but there's so many other things about that, which is faculty credentials. I mean, anytime you want to set a rule for that on average, the most thing you can ever hope for is to be right on average, but you're guaranteed to be a little or a lot wrong in every single instance. And I'm open to the idea that, the credential and the background and education level of faculty actually, in an optimal world, would arise in a lot of variety, depending on local circumstance, by the program, by the students, by the geography in question. And so all of this centralized rulemaking around institutional design, it really is where outcomes, success, innovation goes to die.
And let's bring up another regulatory issue, which is regular and substantive interaction with faculty, which is, the other side of the coin, as you talk about Carnegie Units. Where are we headed in terms of that? And that is a means measure rather than an outcome measure. But it's also a conversation that most universities have a difficulty engaging in with their faculty.
Right. Yeah. Again, I'm a spectator in that fight. Though there's a small way in which accreditors can help or hurt on that issue. But by and large, again, this is another very high stake emanation from federal student aid regulations. I mean, the concept is reasonable. Of course, students should have regular and substantive interactions, but what that exactly looks like by program, by student, online, place-based, probably a topic that the answer there has to vary enormously. I think one small contribution we can make to this is that since we will be so energized about measuring economic outcomes, we as an accreditor, if approved, can, to some degree, be more collaborative with institutions in complying, at least at the level of us as an accreditor, with that regulation, which we are required to co-enforce with FSA. But the main open question there, the main conflict there, is between the institutions and FSA, and I'm not sure how that evolves either. It probably belongs in the same category as the credit hour, I think, which is if we can make enormous, fast, deep, permanent progress on the data systems, measuring fairly, scientifically, the causal contributions by individual institutions to their individual enrollees for their economic output, then I had faith that across the political spectrum, everyone can agree to be less particular about means regulation.
So how are you going about engaging these policymakers and institutional leaders towards building consensus on some of these ideas? I mean,
right.
Talk about that process.
Yeah. I mean, we belong to a hyper-specialized, esoteric, tiny corner of the world you're describing, which is we're going through a demanding, highly monitored process with the U.S. Department of Ed to win recognition over many years as an accreditor. But I think that's a viable idea, and it's because the themes we're talking about in the context of accreditors has a lot of bipartisan support, left and right, because ultimately, what am I talking about here? I'm talking about an accreditor, which is really just another version of a regulator battling with the core questions, which is we're interested in economic safety, mobility, and progress for our students. We're going to invest enormous amounts of time in trying to assess it. We will only accredit where we have a high degree of confidence that that dynamic is present in an institution. We really mean that. And so I think we, as a result, are well received generally. Some of these other issues, David, I think are beyond sort of our province and our very sort of narrow technical path to try to become an accreditor. And again, I want to be modest, which is when and if we're recognized as an accreditor because we're serious about measuring these economic results, we'll also be self-aware and very transparent with how difficult it is to do the job we're asking to do, which is to measure really fairly. And we'll lay off accrediting institutions in states and in jurisdictions where we can't come to a really reliable conclusion for or against that. We'll be limited by the data world out there. We're okay with that. So a lot of what we'll do as an accreditor is say, hey, we're willing to do this work, but we need more and better data. We need partnerships with state leaders, with unemployed. We need to, we need access to the UI wage records, to the K-12 and the higher ed records state by state, so we can go in with our economists and measure this in a way that's fair and try to exemplify this. I'll say one other thing, which is a digression. I am optimistic that states that have built really strong data systems will be the leaders in this work, the most important leaders in this work, and will sort out and make progress towards how to measure fairly and accurately based on really good data systems. And also in defense of federal regulators, left and right, there's very little data at the United States Department of Ed to do this with nuance. What you're witnessing often is a border skirmish about whether to measure almost nothing or a little bit more. But by and large, if you zoom out, the capacity of Congress and the Department of Ed, whether it's red or blue, to actually walk up to an institution and form an opinion that's totally reliable by program, by demographic group, by institutional cohort about whether the economic result is there, actually all parties agree, if only tacitly, that is very limited because the U.S. Department of Ed has very little data given to it by the Census Bureau, by the IRS. So they're stuck in a very, very sparse data environment in their defense.
And I'm assuming we have some states that are further along
Yes.
than others in kind of pushing the agenda.
Yeah. It's worth calling out. Texas is really, by consensus, the furthest along. There's been a prolonged effort down there by policymakers with lots of support to stitch together the high school data by person connected to the higher ed data in that state, to try to connect it to the data of students who leave the state, and to connect, crucially, all of this to the state wage records, which are very comprehensive in Texas because most students there don't leave the state, whether they're educated or not. So there's the possibility there, empirically, to get at, in a relatively straightforward way, the question of that we were at a few minutes ago, which is, hey, Johnny or Susie is showing up at University X in Dallas, let's say. How much would they have made if they didn't enroll? How much did they make on the margin precisely and for no other reasons but the fact that they enrolled? By the way, I'll just say that question, that's an unintimidating question to any average economist. It's just called controlled social science research. The limiter here is not, this is eminently feasible when the data systems are there. And back to your point, Texas is very far along. Virginia is quite far along on this. There are states also that have this data that are reluctant to share it, candidly, for political reasons. There is reluctance in many states for anyone, an academic, a regulator, to come in and actually measure everything because they don't want to know the answer.
Have you had challenging moments where you just thought this is too hard?
It's funny. Sure.
And what keeps you going? When you have those moments.
Yeah, no, I feel lucky just to try to be useful, but well aware that we can do everything right, but we need luck to get through this. And that's true of most good work. You need some things to fall your way. So that's probably been true of most of my career, trying to be helpful in education, which is you try really hard, but so much of this is gummed up in things you can't control, politics and governments and things like that. But no, great mood here. It's really fun work. And if we do everything right and get a little lucky, we'll start a very thoughtful accreditor. And I think that's a step forward.
If you could make a policy change, I know you say that you are on the sidelines in terms of these policy and regulatory things. What would be one or two policies that, especially as it relates to financial aid eligibility, that would make it easier for us to move in this direction?
Yeah, you're probably pointing to federal policy here. All right, so I'm not going to volunteer the thing that naturally hit my mind because it's just probably a symptom of my day job, which is, if I had the steering wheel for 5 minutes, I would make massive investments in these longitudinal data systems across states and federally. I would, of course, guard them in the right privacy protection, the right security concerns, but actually create the data substrate, the basis for real measurement of this stuff, because it changes everything. It can release innovation because you can measure the outcome. It can create a basis for sensible performance-based policy, both funding policies and accountability. So the honest answer is, in the medium to the long term, if we create an empirical, rigorous database on which to run higher ed policy, it really does change everything. So that is my first thought. The other thing I'll say is I'm just a profound fan of the Pell Grant system, and because it is one of the most beautiful public policies we have. We walk up to a very large cross-section of American society. We give these students a voucher, and they can go shop. It's a brilliant idea. I'm a huge fan of investing in students and families to choose. I ultimately believe they are the best, the most powerful, the only permanent arbiter of quality. So let me hit that point really hard. I think government should take a very self-critical, modest, and limited stance on what to measure. It should be the wage outcome, and then government should go home. So the government, what you owe the government in running your institution is proof that you create economic livelihood for your students and therefore their personal freedom. Once you prove that, the rest ought to be left up to you, and then you'll meet your real judge and jury, which are your students. And they'll let you know what they want. So ultimately so I'm a proponent of sensible but limited, fair, accurate government regulation of a public entity like higher ed. And then after that, super energized about millions of families choosing, as should be their right, across a huge span of designs. Online, offline, 2-year, 4-year, lots of faculty talking to people, stuff being delivered via technology, programmatic choices. It's going to vary by geography. So that's just worth pointing out, which is government's role in this has to be very disciplined, very precise, very fair, and then the real sort of overseers of this enterprise, of course, should be the student and their families.
So let's talk about a timeline. When and where can I sign up? And what's realistic in terms of...
realistic for us as an accreditor? Well, thanks a lot. I think, there is a existing regulation been around for a long time. It ponders, it structures how the U.S. Department of Ed should interact with accreditors, mainly, of course, the existing ones, but also ponders the formation of a new one. It's a hard process. It should be a hard process. The recognition we're asking for is a serious one because we'll be able to qualify as an accreditor institution for Title IV. And so it's a long process. This is something, you should think of it as a 6-7 year process. We're probably halfway through it. And there's lots of variation in that. So the short answer is we hope to be done over the next 3-4 years. And at that point, I'll give you a call. We will, we'll take it one step at a time. But yes, then we will be interested in partnering with institutions that care about economic results, that want to be measured fairly and accurately for them, key qualifiers. Those are the institutions we hope to attract.
So what do you wish, this will be the last question, and so what do you wish university leaders like me would know that you think I don't fully understand, or that I could get more nuanced understanding of?
Oh, interesting. You want to qualify that in any way around accreditation, let's say? Already.
That's a wide open question.
That's really good, yeah. Let me think about that. No, I'll just thank you. So I'm not going to answer your question directly. Nothing strikes me. Maybe that's just the modesty in me. But I do, when we zoom out like that, want to say one thing, which is I am appreciative. I know students and families are appreciative of hardworking, self-aware efforts to innovate in U.S. higher education. I love this sector, but I'm also not afraid to say, as its critical friend, that innovation is profoundly suppressed. It's retarded as a dynamic because these institutions are slow to change, they're protected. And so the voluntary efforts by you, by other ambitious, innovative institutions, both online and place-based, they both are really, really important to support because students are are immensely hungry for new models to meet their needs. And I think there's wild evidence for that in what you're doing and what other new providers are doing, which is when there's even a little bit of innovation in higher ed, the student response is massive. So thank you for trying.
Well, thank you. This was great. I appreciate the time. And if there's anything to add to it, just send me a note. I wish you the very best. I think this is critical work. You're moving in the right direction. We'll be watching closely to see your progress over the next couple of years. And I wish you really, really well in moving it forward.
You bet. And hey, as a Massachusetts native, go UMass.
Well, that's it for today. But the conversation doesn't stop here. If we want real change in higher ed, we have to rethink the way we measure success. Share this episode and stay tuned for more bold ideas and candid conversations on It's About Time.